Okay, Matthew chapter 9, beginning in verse 9, here's what it says. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." It was the summer of 2017. I was making some extra cash Uber driving on a Saturday afternoon, when all of a sudden I experienced a strange tingling in my left arm. Fortunately, I was gassing up in a Wawa when this was taking place, so I wasn't driving, I wasn't on the road at the time. But I was curious as to what was happening to me, so as I'm waiting for my tank to fill up, I decided to grab my phone and Google left arm tingling and see what pops up. Because obviously, if you're experiencing some sort of physical disorder that you can't explain, Google is the best place to find some sound medical advice. Yeah, just wait. You're going to hear me make a whole lot of stupid mistakes like that before this story is over. So anyway, I Google left arm tingling, and everything I'm reading says pinched nerve or herniated disc or something like that. But as I'm looking that up, my left leg starts to tingle. And then I started to get dizzy and nauseous, and well, basically, I wasn't able to Google it because I'm not able to see straight. And so fortunately, my tank was done getting filled up, so I started the car and I just pulled into the nearest parking spot that I could find. I leaned my seat back and I waited for the symptoms to pass. For those keeping score, this is stupid mistake number 2. The symptoms didn't pass, they just kept getting worse. So then I tried calling Jen, who was in Camden at the time, volunteering at the World Refugee Day. And well, anyway, between the noise of the event and my slurred speech, she was having trouble understanding what I was saying and suggested I give my parents a call. So I tried my mom, no answer. I tried my dad, no answer. And I think it was at that point that I finally blacked out. Now, I'm not sure how long I was unconscious, but when I finally came to, my first thought was, well, who should I call next? 911, you would think, right? But no, that makes too much sense. I decided that I would call Kathy Warfel. So, because whenever there's a problem, I call Kathy. She always picks up. So I call her, and I tell her what's going on. And somehow, between my blurred vision and my drive heaving out the car door, I managed to get on Google Maps and send her my location so that she and her son, Toby, could come and get me. Now, I was pretty far away from their house at the time, so it took them about 20 or 30 minutes to get to me. But when they finally got there, Kathy said, quote, "Would you like me to take you to the hospital?" The most intelligent thing that was said all day. But no, of course, I'm like, no, I'm fine. I think it's just a pinched nerve or something. And I'm starting to feel a little better. Apparently not better enough to get into Kathy's car in my own strength, that I needed Toby to literally carry me and put me in. But I thought going to the hospital at this point was probably overkill. So they took me home. Toby helped me into the house, sat me on the couch. He asked me if I needed anything. I said, no, man, I'm good. Just need to sleep this off. And if you're keeping track of my stupid decisions, you've probably lost track by now. Anyway, that was Saturday, and so the next day, Sunday morning, I come to church, and after worship, during the break time, I go up to Doug Mayer, as most of you know, is a doctor, and so I start explaining to him my symptoms from the day before. And I said, yeah, I think it's just a pinched nerve or something. And the look on Doug's face, well, let's just say it wasn't a very reassuring look. And at that point, I said to him, do you think I should go to the hospital? I didn't say that. That would make too much sense, right? No, what I said was, oh, look at the time. I got to get up and preach. So I came up, did the sermon, finished with the service. As soon as I get home, I send Doug a text asking him what that face was all about. And then he says to me, that was me trying to convince myself that what you experienced yesterday was just a pinched nerve. And so I took Doug's advice, and I went to the hospital, and they did a bunch of tests. And apparently it was not a pinched nerve, but I had suffered a small stroke. Nothing big, but according to the MRI, enough to cause a little bit of brain damage, which probably explains my poor decision-making. And why 4 years later, when I ended up in the hospital with COVID, Doug had to literally drive me to the hospital because I thought a blood oxygen level of 85% was good. You know, because it's kind of like a B+, right? But apparently it's not good at all. The point is, in both of those situations, I thought I was okay and I didn't need a doctor. But the truth is, I wasn't okay. See, people who think they're okay don't go looking for doctors. Only people who know that they're sick. Because those who are well have no need of a physician. Only those who are sick. And this morning, we're going to see what happens when Jesus, the great physician, engages with people who know that they're sick and those who think they're not. Or more specifically, those who know that they're sinners and those who think they're not. Now, to bring us up to speed, Jesus is once again walking along the Sea of Galilee, and crowds of people are following him, and he's continuing to teach people as he travels along. And as he's walking along the road, he passes by a man named Matthew, who happens to be sitting at the tax booth, which means Matthew is not a popular guy, right? I mean, who likes paying taxes? And you know, it's bad enough when you have to pay them online or through the mail, but at least when you do it that way, you don't have an actual person there taking money from you. Now, of course, the taxes that you pay when you purchase something at the store, you have someone in front of you while you're paying for the item and paying the tax, but you generally don't blame the cashier for the sales tax. It's not their fault that we have to pay it. And sales tax, more specifically customs tax, is what Matthew is busy collecting at this booth. It's why he's on the shores of Galilee. This was a hub for traffic and for trade. And so imagine this. If instead of paying your sales tax to the cashier at the point of purchase, there was a guy sitting at a booth right outside the store, or better yet, sitting at the foot of your driveway when you got home. And it's the same guy every day, and he says the same thing to you every time you see him. Hey, buddy, what's in the trunk? Then you have to open the trunk, let Matthew see what's in there, rummages through it. He sees what you bought that day, and then he'll spout out some random number like, oh, that'll be $20. And then you have no choice but to pay the guy. Otherwise, a bunch of scary dudes with swords are going to show up later on that day. Okay, that's Matthew. He's that guy. Now, maybe what he takes from you isn't as much as your income tax or your property tax, but at least those numbers are predetermined ahead of time. These taxes seem to be a lot more random. Plus, there's that face-to-face interaction, which makes the whole experience a lot more unpleasant. So you're not paying a bill, you're paying Matthew. Plus, if you think about it, a bill you can pay any time, right? As long as it's before the deadline. But see, Matthew, he stops you on your way home. After a long day of buying and selling and traveling, and all you want to do is go home and take a nap, and there's Matthew at his tax booth flagging you down. So you have to pull your donkey over. You got to take the bags off the back. You got to let Matthew look at everything you've got. And then he'll charge you whatever he thinks is appropriate, which at that time was typically anything from 2% all the way up to 12.5%. And you can guarantee that he will almost always charge you more than he should be, and here's why: Matthew doesn't get a salary. In fact, the only reason Matthew has this job is because he won the bid. See, the Roman official who's responsible for keeping track of the taxes in that area, he would sell the right to collect those taxes to the highest bidder. You can just smell the corruption, can't you? Well, that's because you live in New Jersey. You're used to that smell. But anyway, the only way that Matthew could make a living was by overcharging people. And the fact that Matthew is a Jew collecting money for the Roman Empire, well, that made things even worse than they already were, which is why Matthew would have been considered by many to be a traitor, both to the Jews and to God, to the point that the term tax collector became synonymous with the word sinner. Why is he eating with tax collectors and sinners? It was like a catchphrase that the religious leaders would use to describe the dregs of society. People that, respectable folks would stay away from. But not Jesus. See, where most people would try to avoid Matthew and his tax booth at all costs, Jesus, as he's passing by, turns to Matthew and says, "Follow me." And then Matthew rose from his tax booth and he followed Jesus. Sounds a little similar to what happened when Jesus called Peter and Andrew and James and John back in chapter 4. Except for one difference. See, those guys were fishermen. And so if things didn't work out with Jesus, they could always go back to fishing. In fact, at the end of John's gospel, we see them do exactly that. But Matthew, he doesn't have that option. When Matthew got up to follow Jesus, he didn't leave a net or a boat behind. He left a whole tax booth behind. Now, if you're crazy enough to leave your post back then, do you think the Roman government would ever trust you again to collect taxes? Of course not. There's no way. And because you were a tax collector, good luck finding another job. Nobody's going to want you. So when Matthew left his tax booth to follow Jesus, he was leaving everything. He knew that from that moment on, his life would be changed forever. Which is why I think Matthew describes his response to Jesus the way that he does here. Look at verse 9 again. And he rose and followed him. Why does Matthew use those words? Why does he describe it that way? Because that's not how he described Peter and Andrew's response to Jesus. With them, he said what? They left their nets and followed him. And then with James and John, he says something very similar. He says they left their boat and followed him. See, I always wondered why Matthew didn't say he left his booth and followed Jesus. Until I noticed how Matthew uses these same words, "and he rose," to describe the paralytic's response to Jesus just a couple verses earlier in verse 7. He says, "and he rose and went home." See, I think that's intentional. I think Matthew is trying to describe for us what this experience with Jesus was really like. It was like a healing. It was like being delivered from bondage. But in what way? Because, clearly Matthew wasn't in the same predicament as the paralytic, who had to be literally carried to Jesus because he was incapable of moving his own body. The paralytic was also, I'm sure, unemployed and therefore very poor. Unlike Matthew, who not only had a job, but a good job, and was likely very rich. Not to mention the fact that he didn't need a stretcher in order to get around. And yet, it seems as if Matthew wants us to see what Jesus did for him through the same lens that we saw what Jesus did for the paralytic just a few verses earlier. Just like the man who was paralyzed, Matthew also rose in response to Jesus, as if he too were being set free from a lifetime of bondage. Interestingly, another tax collector named Zacchaeus had a very similar life-changing experience. If you're not familiar with Zacchaeus, his story is found in Luke chapter 19. But he was another tax collector who met Jesus and whose life was instantly changed, just like Matthew's was. And all Jesus said to Zacchaeus was, "Today I'm eating at your house," which to us sounds pretty rude, right? Could you imagine if after service I came up to you and I said, "Today I'm eating at your house"? Kind of weird and kind of rude. But I'm also not Jesus. And we're not living in the same kind of culture that they were living in back then. See, back then, for a teacher or for a rabbi to share a meal with someone, that was considered a pretty big deal. And it typically wasn't an offer that was made to just anyone on the street, and certainly not a tax collector. In fact, I would venture to say that Matthew was probably the very first one. And then 3 years later, when Jesus does the same thing with Zacchaeus, personally, I think in that moment, Matthew cracked a smile. Maybe teared up a little as he thought back to when Jesus did the same thing for him. And then Jesus eats at Matthew's house, right? That's what happens next. Jesus and his disciples, they go to a house party, and we know from the other gospel accounts that the house was Matthew's house. And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, verse 10, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And then this is where we find our anchor text for this morning, verse 12. But when he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means." And then Jesus quotes from the book of Hosea, where God says, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." And then the rest of that verse in Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6 says this, "The knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." In other words, what God truly desires is relationship, not religion. But see, the Pharisees didn't understand that. And neither did the disciples of John the Baptist, who were also at this gathering and who apparently identified more with the Pharisees than they did with Jesus and his disciples. We see that in verse 14, where they say, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast?" See, we're on this team. "And you, other guys, your disciples do not fast." You know, Jesus is so patient. He doesn't judge these guys. He could have. And he doesn't get upset with them either. But instead, Jesus takes this opportunity to teach them. And we're not going to go too deep with these last few verses. I think the most important thing to see here is that the way that Jesus engages with people, in other words, the way that he does ministry, it might seem strange to the Pharisees and to John's disciples, but it really isn't. See, their obsession with religion, it's not only pointless, it's destructive. And that fact should be obvious to everyone. like putting a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Jesus is like, no one does that. And why? Because everybody knows that it makes the tear worse. Just like no one puts new wine that's still fermenting into old wineskins. Because if you do that, the skins will burst and you'll have a huge mess on your hands. Everybody knows that. No one fasts at a wedding. See, what Jesus is doing is he's saying, look, I know my approach may seem strange to you, but it's really not. Just like these other things I mentioned, it's obvious. At least it should be. Because it's revealed to us right here in the book of Hosea, a book that at that time was over 700 years old. Mercy comes first. Love comes first, not the law. Now, does that mean that the law doesn't matter? Or that spiritual disciplines like fasting and prayer, is Jesus saying that those things have no value? Well, we already know that he's not saying that, right? In the Sermon on the Mount, for instance, Jesus said, I did not come to abolish the law, but to what? Fulfill it, right? So in other words, follow me and you will fulfill the law. And yes, you should pray, but pray this way. Our Father, who art in heaven. And yes, you should fast, but when I say the time is right to fast. See, the point that Jesus is making is this. All of these, quote, religious things, they have a purpose, but their purpose is only found in him. See, Matthew's life was changed in an instant. Like a paralyzed man being set free. That's how he describes it. Not because he followed the law and fasted twice a week, but because he met Jesus. See, religion says you need to do this and this and this, and then God will accept you. Jesus says, follow me. Get up out of your tax booth and be my disciple. See, Jesus invites us just as we are. And then our lives change because he invites us, because he calls us, and not the other way around. See, Jesus doesn't tell us to fix ourselves so we can follow him. He's the one who fixes us. He's the one who heals us. But instead, the religious people say what? Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? They're not church people. They don't deserve to be in our presence. They need to clean up their act first. These people are sick. They need a doctor. And Jesus' response to that is, I am the doctor. Look, if a doctor is surrounded by sick people, does that make him a bad doctor? No. That just means he's doing his job. And that's what Jesus is saying to these religious guys. He's like, where else would I be? Why am I eating with sinners? Where else would I be? And here's the other thing. The Pharisees are sinners too, right? Their team is a bunch of sinners too. The only problem is they don't see it that way. See, Jesus' team has tax collectors and prostitutes and gamblers and loan sharks. And the Pharisees' team has a bunch of well-trained Bible scholars with high IQs who have dedicated their lives to keeping the commandments, plus all the additional laws that they wrote, and not necessarily in that order. So it looks like the Pharisees have a more qualified team than Jesus does, but looks can be deceiving. See, religious people have a hard time recognizing their sin. They can see immorality, but they can't see self-righteousness. They can see cheating and stealing, but they can't see legalism or pride. And so the Pharisees' team might look better on the outside, but the truth is they are a lot further away from the kingdom of God than the crowd that Jesus is hanging out with, because at least those guys know that they're sinners. See, Jesus doesn't disagree that his dinner guests are sinners. Did you notice that? When the Pharisees accused him of eating with tax collectors and sinners, Jesus didn't argue that point. He didn't make excuses for them. He's like, I know they're sinners. Could you imagine hearing Jesus say that while you have a mouthful of potatoes? Like, what did he say? I know they're sinners, but I didn't come to call the righteous. I came to call sinners. And at least these guys know that that's what they are. See, it all goes back to what we said at the beginning. If you don't know you're sick, you're not going to go looking for a doctor. And if you don't know you're a sinner, you're not going to see your need for a Savior. Jesus is the great physician. He heals us and he forgives us. But the first thing Jesus does is he loves us. Hey, Zacchaeus, come down out of that tree. We're eating at your house today. Matthew, come follow me. And bring some of your tax collector buddies along with you so I can get to know them too. And so they can get to know me. See, that's our mission. As disciples of Jesus, our mission is to bring people to Jesus. Not to a religion, but to a person. To introduce them to the great physician, to the only one who can set them free from the bondage, from the paralysis of their sin. Just like he did for us. But see, that's never going to happen if we judge people before they have a chance to meet him. That's why at Church Without Borders, we strive to be a place where it's okay not to be okay. Not because we don't think it's possible for people to change and to see their lives turned around. We do believe that. But we also know that that can only happen when people have the opportunity to meet Jesus. Without any requirements or rules or hoops to jump through. But just as we are, sick and broken, and in need of a Savior.